This podcast is brought to you by WRFL, Radio Free Lexington. Find us online at wrfl.fm. Catch us on your FM radio while you're in Central Kentucky at 88.1 FM all the way to the left. Thank you for listening, and please be sure to subscribe.
Welcome to From the Woods, Kentucky. I'm Lhotka, and I'm here with my co-host, Renee Williams. And today in studio, we have Dr. Steve Price and Dr. Matt Springer. Dr. Price is an associate professor of stream and riparian ecology, and Dr. Springer is an assistant extension professor of wildlife management, and both of them work in the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources at the University of Kentucky. So it's a pleasure to have you two in studio today.
Glad to be here. Thanks.
Today we're going to be talking about snakes, and we've had both of you on the show before, but for those new listeners out there, tell us a little bit about what you do at UK. Dr. Price, you want to start?
I'm an associate professor in the department, and I teach and do research. My research focuses on aquatic and semi-aquatic animals, and currently we do a lot of research on reptiles and amphibians. I teach a course in herpetology, which is the study of reptiles and amphibians, every spring. During the fall and summer, I offer other courses for both undergraduate and graduate students.
And then I am a faculty member here in the department. I'm also the state extension specialist for wildlife. So my duties, the majority of them are actually working with our county agents in all of our 120 counties in Kentucky. So I travel a lot doing programs related to extension outreach and wildlife. I also have a little bit of teaching responsibilities and research responsibilities within the department. Most of my research right now is looking and working with wildlife damage problems in Kentucky.
How long have you both been working with snakes?
Well, I've been working with snakes for quite a long time, even before I came to the University of Kentucky. So I've studied snakes in terms of looking at how they use habitat and how much habitat they use. I'm a lot involving radio telemetry, where we follow snakes around through the environment by tracking little beeps that come from radio transmitters. I've worked on some invasive snake problems in Florida, and now at University of Kentucky I work on questions related to snake natural history as well as disease ecology.
Professionally, I haven't really had to work with snakes too much, not even close to what Dr. Price does. I have to deal with some snake issues with my extension duties, so I'll say professionally it starts there. However, I got in trouble a lot as a kid, bringing snakes home with my mom. About the age of 5, I started having pet snakes that I caught in the wild, and that actually turned into a hobby of production with corn snakes and going and breeding them and kind of learn genetics that way a little bit. Lifelong enjoyer of snakes, professionally only 3 years.
So you mentioned that you had done some research about kind of the snakes and their range. What is their range, or how
much habitat
how
do
much
they use?
yeah.
Yeah, it varies based on the snake species. You know, we have snakes in Kentucky, for example, that some species only get to be about 6 inches long, and then we have other species that get to be 6 feet long.
Yeah.
And as you imagine, the smaller ones use a very small amount of habitat, right? So they may use an area the size of, a typical backyard or something like that and spend their whole life in that area, whereas a larger snake species may use several acres and different times of year use different areas. So it's really quite variable.
Okay. How did you track them? Would you catch them and put something on them, or explain that? I'm
curious.
Yeah,
I was curious about that too.
To open up a little box here with the radio telemetry. Radio telemetry is a process where you have a receiver and antenna, and you're tracking a small pulse from a radio transmitter, right? And it's used in all kinds of wildlife studies. People can have used it to study birds or mammals, and usually you adhere them to a belt and put it on the animal or something like that. With snakes, it's a little bit of a problem because they have no limbs, so it's hard to put a backpack on them. So essentially, you have to surgically implant it.
Okay.
And then you kind of run the antenna down the side of the body of the snake, and it's all inside of the snake's body. You go out every couple days, you follow the pulses, and you find out what that snake's doing. And we learned a lot of very interesting things. Some of these snakes know their environments very well. They'll come back every time. So snakes regularly have to shed their skin. So they will come back to the exact same spot within acres of forest to shed their skin every time. And then during other times of year, they may move to close to a barn or another area to forage back to the forest. So you can learn a lot of interesting stuff using radio telemetry.
How many species are there?
In Kentucky? So there's 32 species in Kentucky, okay, and out of those 32, and I figured this is where this question is going next. There's only 4 that are venomous, okay, and those are our 4 pit viper species. So those include pygmy rattlesnakes, which are very uncommon in Kentucky and only occur in the land between the lakes area. And then we have timber rattlesnakes, which are fairly widespread but occur at pretty low densities throughout the state. Really only the bluegrass region lacks timber rattlesnakes. And then we have the copperhead, which is the most common venomous snake in Kentucky. And these are snakes that have really unique hourglass-shaped blotches on their back. They can almost be a red or russet type color. I think a very pretty snake. But they occur throughout the state and can be very common in some areas, especially in eastern Kentucky. And then finally we have the cottonmouth, which is a semi-aquatic snake. So you tend to find them around swamps, rivers, lakes, things like that. But they're only found in about the western third of Kentucky.
So I'm going to jump in here because I get a lot of questions with an extension. And I mentioned professionally I have only about 3 years of actual snake experience. And most of that is identifying from pictures and the 20-some emails I'll get here starting in about a week.
Yeah.
Right. Already had one, actually.
Yes, we had one yesterday, and it's starting. But some of the common questions I get are, especially related to venomous snakes, are, so which one is the most venomous? If you had to pick which one you absolutely didn't want to get bit by,
What is
it? What is the worst one?
Yeah. So to take a step back here, first I'd like to say that larger snakes, tend to have larger venom glands. So if you ever take a close look at the head of a venomous snake, and you could do this by looking maybe at our snake identification website and take a close look, they tend to have kind of a heart-shaped head, right? And back behind their eyes, the musculature looks kind of enlarged, and there's large venom glands back there, okay? So first of all, just thinking about the amount of venom a snake could deliver, generally a larger venomous snake can deliver more venom, will deliver more venom than a smaller venomous snake.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
So when we think about our larger venomous snakes in Kentucky, the largest one is the timber rattlesnake, and then the second largest one is probably the cottonmouth. Both of them can deliver a fairly potent venom, and both of them, the venom is toxic enough to cause severe damage to muscles. And in some cases, and I don't know when the last case of mortality in Kentucky was reported, but in some cases, both of these snakes have led to mortality if the person that was bitten doesn't go to the hospital right away. If you go to the hospital, usually things turn out pretty well.
So it's not necessarily the species of snake, but the size of the snake that would be more concerning.
Right, and so I'm not an expert on venom chemistry, and it's variable even among the same snake species. But generally, we think about it as there are some what we call hemotoxins that damage muscles, okay, and then neurotoxins which affect the nervous system and can cause problems with breathing and things like that, okay. Sometimes we tend to think of this as like a dichotomy among snakes, like a lot of our pit vipers, have more hemotoxic venom, which will cause swelling and severe damage to muscles, and then other species that we don't have in Kentucky, but like coral snakes and cobras we tend to think have neurotoxins. Recent research has shown that the chemistry of venom, depending on the species, can contain both hemotoxins and neurotoxins, and even among a single species, let's say the timber rattlesnake, it can be variable among different populations. I don't know if that gets at your question.
Sure, yeah. Right, I just learned something, so that's nice. I'm going to be able to at least answer the public a little bit better. For sure.
So I would recommend not getting bit by any venomous snake is my first recommendation. If you do happen to get bitten by one, a larger snake has the potential to deliver more venom than a smaller one.
So if you do get bit and you're in the woods, how long do you have to get out of the woods before you're in some serious danger?
Serious danger?
Like death, or not being able to walk anymore to get out of the woods.
Yeah, so it depends where you get bit, of course, but for all of our snake or venomous snake species in Kentucky, I mean, you should try to get to a medical professional as soon as possible, right? The best thing to do is have somebody with you that has a set of car keys. You can get in a car and drive someplace. But if you're by yourself and you would have multiple hours, if not days, before something really bad would happen with all of our snake species.
That's good.
Again, it's best just not to get bit and leave snakes. Leave
From
the
what I
venomous snakes where
understand, they don't want to be around you as much as you don't want to be around them and get bit. Am I right on that?
Oh, of course, yeah. Sometimes people refer to snakes as being aggressive. I always refer to them as being defensive. And their behaviors associated with being defensive is either remain camouflage and incredibly still, and that's what we see in something like a timber rattlesnake, which most of our timber rattlesnakes, if you encounter them in a forested setting, they aren't even going to rattle, okay? They're just going to freeze and remain still. And then their secondary defense is to try to get away from you. Okay. Unfortunately, for a lot of our pit vipers, they're not super fast, so they'll kind of crawl away, try to get into a rock crevice or someplace and cover. And then finally, if they can't manage to get away and they feel incredibly threatened, then that's when bites occur. For many venomous snakes, snake bites in Kentucky usually involve somebody handling the snake or getting too close to the snake, especially in the case of timber rattlesnakes. Occasionally people get bit by copperheads because they are nocturnal and they can be stepped on at night.
So what should you wear walking in the woods? Or is there something that can help just protect you? Boots or...
Yeah, I'd always recommend just wearing a good sturdy pair of hiking boots. Okay. And there are products that certain professionals that work in forest situations wear, snake chaps and things like that. But usually a good pair of hiking boots can protect you.
Just for the normal person.
Just have your eyes open and be aware of your surroundings. That's a good recommendation as well. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, you basically just wear your regular shoes when you go hiking in the woods, don't you?
Oh yeah.
It's I there are certain places when I was in Western Kentucky that I would commonly encounter cottonmouths would be the only time I actually wore my snake boots, and that was the only, mostly because I stepped on one time, so that was just happened. So that was enough to wake me up. But like I said, even in that situation, I didn't get bit. The snake just reacted and went away. So it was an eye-opening experience for me.
Right.
But I don't, for most of the places, it's more common sense behaviors I think would probably make more sense. Like don't flip rocks or stick your hands in under trees or things like that would be a little more of a concerning behavior that would end up getting you bit.
Right. Yeah, a lot of times snakes will kind of curl up and wait for... venomous snakes are what we call sit-and-wait predators. So they sit along a log next to a tree, any kind of pathway that maybe a little mammal would use, right? So they sit there coiled up and wait for this prey item to move through the area. Unfortunately, sometimes we step over rocks or lean up against trees and do other things and don't pay attention to our surroundings. And then that might lead to stepping on a snake. And as Matt mentioned, a lot of times when you even step on them, they won't bite. Okay. And another thing I should mention too is that sometimes venomous snakes will bite and they won't deliver any venom. Okay, we call that a dry bite, and that probably happens somewhat frequently. The main purpose of the venom is to capture prey and begin the digestion process of those prey, and secondarily it's a defensive mechanism.
So what do snakes eat?
Yeah, all kinds of things. Okay, we have a pretty decent diversity of snakes, so we'd expect a diversity of prey items. Okay, so we have everything from our very small woodland snakes like ringneck snakes or red-bellied snakes. We'll eat a lot of invertebrates, soft-bodied invertebrates, especially like worms and slugs, and maybe small salamanders. And some of our medium-sized snakes, let's say like a black king snake or a prairie king snake, they eat a lot of rodents. Sometimes they eat other snakes as well. Okay, so I always say, what fits inside of a snake better than another snake, right? It makes a perfect food item. We have some snakes that are specialists that only eat one or a few things. We have a snake in western Kentucky called the mud snake, a pretty large snake, 5 feet long as adults, maybe a little longer, that specializes in eating aquatic salamanders called sirens and amphiumas. That's pretty much all they eat. We have a snake in central Kentucky called a queen snake that they only eat freshly molted crayfish. Okay, so very specialized diet. And then
it's a certain cuisine that snake wants.
that they prefer, right? And then a lot of our venomous snakes, they'll eat small mammals, squirrels, mice, things like that. And then a few species consume birds and bird eggs as well.
So let's talk a little bit about the snake identification website. How can people get to it, and tell us a little bit what people can see if they go to it?
The snake identification website is something that started working on maybe 4 years ago or so, and have been working on this product and adding to it for quite some time. We like to think of it as kind of a go-to guide for everything you need to know about snakes and quickly identify them in Kentucky. Okay, so you can learn about where different snake species are found in Kentucky, their geographic range, for instance, and whether the snakes are venomous or non-venomous, some characters that you'd want to look at to identify these snakes. And these characters include things like the types of scales the snakes have, whether they have a rough or keeled appearance to the scale, or do they have smooth scales, the structure of their eye, things like that, the structure of their head. You can take these kind of characters or attributes, and it can help you narrow down which snake species you have observed. Okay, so we like to think of it as a way for people to learn about snakes and to try to ID snakes that they've seen.
So that website can be found at kysnakes.ca.uky.edu. Gets quite a bit of use, especially here in about a month when everything comes out of hibernation and starts getting active. Upwards of, I think the most we've had was 20,000 hits in a month. So we're getting quite a bit of use. There's actually, we worked in a function that you can actually report your snake. If you see something we have a few snakes that we're especially interested in that are either not seen quite a bit because of behaviors, or they're just rare within Kentucky. So there's actually a little button that if you go on there and that pops up to be the snake you identified in that ID your snake page, that you can actually report it to us and let us know that you've seen it, and potentially leave some information for us if we want to contact you later. We think of it as a nice catch-all as a first step if you come into something that you are curious about and want to identify, whether that be because you're concerned it's venomous. And one of those, every snake at the beginning is always a copperhead. And we try to get it from there to something else that is a little less concerning. Definitely it's a feature that we've gotten a positive response, especially from our agents and the public through the agents, that it's quite useful and easy for most folks to follow.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview. And tell us what's happening in a month. You keep mentioning a lot of snakes coming in a month.
Well, that gets more into Steve's realm of why in about a month are we going to have a lot of snake reports, Steve?
Yeah. Well, right now, most of our snake species are still in hibernation. Okay, so they hibernate either underground or in rock crevices, but they're generally inactive during the winter months. Okay, and then by about mid-April, as soon as temperatures start warming up and temperatures become regularly warm, snakes will start emerging from hibernation. People tend to see a lot of snakes in the springtime, mostly because the vegetation hasn't all come out yet, so these snakes are out in the open, and that's why we get a lot of reports in mid-April as these snakes become quite active. Yeah.
So how long do snakes live? I mean, how many times do they go through that hibernation process?
Again, a lot of variability because we have a lot of species, but there are some that probably live for 10, 12, 15 years in the wild in Kentucky. Timber rattlesnakes are a good example of an especially long-lived snake species, where it may take them 4 or 5 or 6 years to reach sexual maturity, so ages to breed, and then after that, females will produce litters probably every other year and may live for another 10 years after that, or maybe even longer. Yeah.
So, Steve, you just mentioned litters. That kind of alludes to the fact that they give live birth. I get a common question of, I think I found a snake egg. Is it possible it's a snake egg? Most of the time, I walk through and it really isn't a snake. It's usually a turtle egg. Yeah. But are there species of snakes that do lay eggs? Are there some that don't? How does that kind of break down? Are there groups that do and don't?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so some snake species lay eggs, and other snake species give birth to live young. Okay? For example, all of our pit vipers, our venomous snakes, give birth to live young in Kentucky. Okay? So if somebody says, hey, I found a copperhead egg, well, copperheads don't lay eggs. Okay? So all of those species give birth to live young. Our water snake species, We have several species of water snakes. They give birth to live young as well. Garter snakes give birth to live young. And I think that's a species that oftentimes people witness giving birth to live young. You might have a big female garter snake, which is a very common, probably the most common snake species in Kentucky, in your backyard, and all of a sudden you notice, 20 or 30 little garter snakes around her, all crawling around.
That many, huh?
Yeah, a big one can give birth to have pretty sizable litters, 30 or 40 baby snakes, right? I think we have about roughly half of our snake species give birth to live young in Kentucky, and then the other half lay eggs. So these snakes that lay eggs find some place that's warm, okay, not too hot, but warm. Think of like a decomposing leaf pile, or sometimes people report them from sawdust piles near their house. Other species lay on eggs under logs or in rock crevices, someplace protected where the eggs are warm enough where they won't dry out. Okay, This is a side note. I don't know if anybody here has ever felt a snake egg, but it's much softer, and that shell is much more pliable compared to like a bird or a chicken egg that would be much more rigid. Okay, so it's soft to the touch.
I always feel like it's more like leather.
Yeah, leathery.
In feel than say a shell like a chicken egg shell.
And if you compare it to a chicken egg, what's the size?
Smaller.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, maybe the size of like a robin's egg for some species, but of course our real small snakes, lay very small egg, maybe about twice the size of like a Tic Tac or something like that. Okay. But quite small. And so the snakes that lay eggs, they lay in a certain microclimate that is suitable for those eggs, and then they'll hatch out within a couple months. And oftentimes towards the end of summer, late August through late September, a lot of these hatchlings emerge. And then we tend to see an uptick of reports at that time of year too, because you see a lot of little snakes crawling around that have hatched.
So if the snake has eggs, how many eggs do they have? Are they still in the 30 range?
There's some species that can have clutch sizes close to that. A lot of our small ones will lay like 2 or 3 eggs.
Do the mother snakes stay by the nest, or how does that work?
There's a few species that do stay by the nest in Kentucky, and then of course if there's some species that aren't found in Kentucky that brood their eggs as well. But in Kentucky, like the mud snake, for example, which I mentioned is that salamander eater, they stay by their eggs, and they kind of guard the clutches. Okay, but other snakes just find a good nesting spot, lay their eggs, and then take off.
Okay.
No parental involvement.
Right, yeah.
Don't want to pay for college.
Right, yeah.
One of the big things that I always get asked is not necessarily an easy answer, because there's multiple species outside of snakes that do this role, but why should we want snakes around? It could be that we don't want venomous snakes around, but what good do they serve? Say, if I have a backyard and a garden, why should I want to actually see snakes around?
Yeah. Well, I think that snakes play a very important role ecologically, and I'll tell you why. We say this for a lot of different things, but they can occur in pretty significant densities, and they can be important predators for things that we would consider to be pests. Okay, for example, in a garden situation, if we have a lot of small, maybe brown snakes or smooth earth snakes, and these are small indiscript snakes that are maybe 6 or 8 or 10 inches long in and around our garden, sometimes people get worried, right? But what these snakes are doing is they're probably eating the slugs and other things that would be destroying the plants, and so they can be a good thing to have in your garden. They can help protect your vegetables or other things that you're growing. Okay, and then as I mentioned before, a lot of snakes eat rodents. And rodents are notorious pests, especially in agricultural situations. So milk snake in your barn or a gray rat snake in your barn can be a really good thing, okay? And they can keep those rodent populations down. Even in forest settings, snakes can be very important. There's been a study done in the northeastern United States, okay, that looked at timber rattlesnakes and their role in actually eating rodents that are I guess, the carriers for Lyme disease, okay? So they can eat these rodents and reduce that disease across landscapes, so they can play important roles like that as well. In addition, I think as with a lot of our animals, snakes are really interesting and kind of cool to have around, and they're a really important part of our natural heritage here in Kentucky. I hear all kinds of great snake stories from people all the time, right? Those things are exciting to me, and I think that when people consider snakes, it's quite a bit of polarization, right? You either really like snakes or you really dislike snakes, but almost everybody is interested in snakes. And I think that's a good thing when we show interest towards our natural environment here in Kentucky.
Yeah, it's unfortunate that I think there's a skew in the wrong direction in terms of I really don't like snakes, but we're trying to change a few minds to hopefully get people back on the other side. You mentioned how many snake species we have in Kentucky. How are they doing in terms of, say, population size? Are they increasing, declining? Is there things that we need to be concerned about?
Well, there's some snake species that seem to be holding their own and doing pretty well in Kentucky. People often see garter snakes, even in suburban areas in Kentucky, and they seem to be doing pretty well on a diet of earthworms and small amphibians. Another highlight, I think, of Kentucky is we're one of the few states, not snakes, one of the few states where timber rattlesnakes seem to be doing okay. Most other states throughout their range, their populations have declined significantly. And there probably has been a decline in some areas of Kentucky, but we still have pretty good timber rattlesnake populations in some areas. So I think that's good for these charismatic animals. There's other species that they're just really hard to find, and we don't know what their populations are like. There's a species called the scarlet snake, which is a subterranean snake that has a little upturned scale by the tip of its nose that it uses to enlarge burrows. It eats mostly reptile eggs. It's only really active during the summer months, and they are just notoriously difficult to find. So we really don't have a grasp of what their populations are like. And I'd probably say that's true for about half our snake species, similar to that scarlet snake. We don't know. And then there's some other snake species that, are just not doing as well as they used to. And a lot of that is due to just kind of how we manage landscapes. There used to be a lot more prairie or grassland type habitat, especially in western Kentucky. And with the removal of fire from landscapes, the snake species that are kind of associated with those types of environments have declined. There is a new emerging threat to snakes in Kentucky, and it's a disease called snake fungal disease caused by a fungus in the genus Ophidiomyces. Okay, and it's a fungus that eats the kind of at the scales of snakes, and it results in lesions that look like blisters or just kind of rotten scales on the snakes. And we have seen this in over a dozen snake species in Kentucky, both in our pit vipers and in a lot of our water snakes and garter snakes and racers and milk snakes. We're not sure if this threat is resulting in population declines, but we do know it changes snakes' behaviors a little bit. They tend to bask, and as I mentioned probably in my last episode, that these animals warm their bodies by basking in the sun. And so we see diseased snakes basking much more frequently, which makes sense. They're fighting off an infection. But that can lead to increased predation rates. A hawk will come down and then take a snake that's basking. And then they don't move as much as regular snakes, so they tend to stay put. But we're not sure if it's actually leading to decreased survival and reductions in populations. But it's definitely something we need to keep an eye on if we want to think about conserving and managing snakes in Kentucky going forward.
And you went very much in depth there in some of the potential impacts of that fungal disease, and I have a feeling it's because you're currently working on that and research in your lab. Is that right?
Yeah, that's one of our focal areas right now, and we actually study this in really two common widespread species in central Kentucky. The northern water snake, which is a snake that maybe gets about 3.5 feet long as a big adult, and queen snake, which is that crayfish specialist that I mentioned before. And both these snakes are super common, right? If anybody goes to small creek or a river in central Kentucky and flips a few rocks, you'll be able to find these two snake species. But both of them have this disease, and up to 60% of the queen snakes we see at our study sites have the disease. Yeah, and so we are tracking these snakes and looking at their populations, and we've been doing so over the last 4 years to see if snake fungal disease is causing population declines.
And are they seeing it in the surrounding states, or have they studied it yet?
Yeah, it's pretty common throughout the Northeast,
Okay.
Midwest, and the Southeast United States. It's getting into some of the prairie states. It hasn't been found in the West Coast yet, and or in the Rocky Mountains. It has been found in Europe as well, so I think in the UK and maybe like Switzerland or something. It's a new it's an emerging disease that we're starting to get more and more records for. 10 years ago, people weren't really studying this or aware of this disease.
So are there concerns related, sounds, the impacts that you mentioned on the actual snake's physiology and its actual structure of its body, so very similar to something like white nose syndrome in bats. Is there a concern that it may have the same level of impact over time as it spreads, or is it going to be, you think, a much slower, less of a population, bats, you go to a hibernaculum, all the bats would be dead because of white nose syndrome. It doesn't sound like it's that terrible, per se, but it could be something that over time really adds to like habitat fragmentation and all the other things that affect snake populations.
Yeah, I would say first of all it's really hard to know because it's really hard to find enough snakes in the environment to study that. So you can walk into a hibernaculum and find a lot of bats and record mortality, and that's what happened with white nose. It's very difficult to find a spot like that, especially in Kentucky that's a little bit warmer and the snakes don't communally hibernate. Okay, they kind of hibernate singly or just in small groups. It's hard to find those spots, and it's really hard to find. It's hard to find snakes in general. So that's one of the things we worry about this disease. Like maybe we're missing a pretty significant threat to these animals, and they're experiencing severe population declines. But you know what? We're not really good at finding snakes, so we can't answer this question. Okay. Another thing to consider, though, is that the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, my understanding is it was introduced from Europe, okay, and the bats here were naive to that pathogen, and it spread like crazy through the populations. We think that the fungus that is causing a snake fungal disease is native to North America, but it's emerging and becoming much more frequent for reasons that we're not clear on. Okay, the disease progression here could take different pathways. Okay.
You've been listening to From the Woods, Kentucky with co-hosts Renee and Laura. We'll be right back after this short break.
Welcome back to From the Woods, Kentucky. Let's get back to our interview.
Okay, so I know a lot of people, they automatically think when they see a snake that it's venomous. And so how can we let our listeners know the difference?
Yeah.
Like, don't kill the snake just because you think it's venomous. It might not be. So what can we do to help that out?
I would say that our venomous snake species, most of the or all of them, share kind of a similar body shape and form. Okay, a large head, heart-shaped or triangular-shaped head. Okay, usually a pretty heavy-bodied snake. So you're not going to have a venomous snake that's the pencil thin. Okay, we're talking a snake that has some girth to it. Okay, they often are quite slow movers, and they tend to they will coil up in a defensive posture if they feel threatened and cornered. There are some other characteristics that you can look at. If you're not really sure what this snake it is, you got to get kind of close to look at it. So I don't really recommend
best not
this,
to do
right?
that.
But being pit vipers, what these snakes have is they have heat sensing pits. right below the nostrils, kind of on the sides of the heads. So it's like an extra pair of nostrils. And the pit vipers have it. None of the other snakes have it. You have to get kind of close to the snake's head to see this. I don't recommend it if you're trying to identify a live snake, okay? The pupils can help as well. Our pit vipers have kind of vertically or cat-like pupils, and our non-venomous snakes have rounded pupils. That works great for Kentucky. Elsewhere, like don't go to Central America and try to use that to identify venomous snakes, but that's a good characteristic as well. There's some differences when it comes to scale patterns that I won't bore the audience with, but those are another clues. But I think probably my best advice is if you don't know if the snake is venomous or not, usually you can get, and especially with cameras today, a decent picture of these animals that could allow somebody to identify it without having to get super close to them. So take a picture of the animal, send them to Matt, or maybe
go to our website.
Go to the website.
Start at the website.
Right. And we can help ID. There's other people that can help you ID these snakes as well. But that's probably my best advice.
I do prefer to get the pictures of alive snakes, not dead snakes. I do get grumpy after a while, and we'll just potentially respond and say that's just a dead snake. We like to see them stay alive, obviously, in most cases.
Because there's a lot of benefits that you've already described.
Yes, for that reason,
Yeah, and keep in mind, most snakes in Kentucky are not venomous. Okay.
28 out of 32,
yeah,
is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, so
good odds.
Good odds,
Good odds.
yes.
Yeah.
So probably most people are killing non-venomous snakes.
I get way more pictures of non-venomous snakes than anything else. I usually only get, so out of the, say, 200 emails, I may get 5 to 10 that are actually a venomous snake.
Okay.
So it's a really low percentage of actually encountering venomous snakes.
And I imagine gray or black rat snakes are the most common.
Black rat snakes are one of the most common ones that I get, and milk snakes, because milk snakes have a pattern. And unfortunately, we have many snakes that have patterns, and everyone that sees a pattern thinks copperhead, because copperheads have a very distinct pattern.
Yeah.
That's a obvious reaction if you don't know a lot about how to ID snakes. If you see a pattern, it sets off some alarm bells. On the front end of things, I'd like people to go to the ID Your Snake page so you can take a look at some of those snakes that you really should, familiarize yourself with to be safe, so you don't see something and react to it. And unfortunately, potentially for that snake that's non-venomous, cause an end.
Yeah.
In many cases. So
are there venomous snakes in Lexington?
Probably not.
I mean, there could be, obviously, but...
Well, probably historically, there were copperheads and maybe timber rattlesnakes in the inner bluegrass of Kentucky. We don't get many, if any, reports. Maybe down in the Palisades area near the Kentucky River, there are some copperhead populations there.
Raven Run,
there's
been
Raven
confirmed copperheads. So you're getting the southern Fayette County there would be right about where you would probably start running into things again.
Right. In Lexington, very doubtful. Most of the snakes that people see in Lexington are common garter snakes, and black or gray rat snakes are the same species. We could just call them rat snakes, but and they're the most common large snake in Kentucky. And as Matt mentioned, milk snakes are commonly reported as well. And then around creeks and streams, you get northern water snakes and queen snakes.
So one of the features you mentioned for venomous snakes was the eyes and head shape. One that people commonly refer to are, I was listening for a rattle. And you talked about how in most cases rattlesnakes don't even rattle unless they're absolutely, scared for their lives or want to make sure you're aware of them. Is that unique to rattlesnakes? I've picked up snakes before and had their tail shaken. Is that more of a defensive posture for most snakes, or is that distinctly rattlesnakes?
It's not distinctly rattlesnakes. You're right. A lot of snakes will rapidly vibrate their tail, and sometimes if they do this in dry leaves or dry grasses, it can resemble the sound of a buzzing or a rattle. Okay, snakes that commonly rattle their tails when they're stressed out and worried about being eaten or captured are black racers, rat snakes. Milk snakes will do it. A lot of our king snakes, black king snakes, prairie king snakes will do that behavior as well. And these are all kind of large, medium-sized body snakes, which could be easily confused with a rattlesnake or a copperhead. So I think it's just a common defensive mechanism. when the snake is stressed out.
But you said they don't actually have a rattle.
But they don't actually
they
have
just
a
make
rattle.
the sound by hitting something.
They
else.
just they
know
don't
that's a
have
good
rattle.
way to get people away from them, right?
Yeah, they don't have a rattle on their tail tip, and the only snakes with rattles on their tail tips, the timber rattlesnake and the pygmy rattlesnake in Kentucky. The pygmy rattlesnake's a really tiny little rattlesnake, and its rattle sounds like the buzzing of an insect. A big timber rattlesnake with a decent sized rattle, is almost like a maraca-like sound.
What's in it that makes it
It's
rattle?
dry keratinized scales, or it's scales that are partially shed, and they accumulate at the end of the tail, so they're dry, and then when they shake that, they kind of rub up against one another and make a rattling sound.
You mentioned earlier about them going back to the same spot to shed their skin. How often do they do that?
Usually in the wild, 3-4 times, maybe 5 times during the course of an active season, from April through October.
Okay.
Yeah. A snake needs to shed its skin in order to grow.
Oh, okay.
So if there's a lot of resources available, meaning there's a lot of prey and it's chowing down and it's growing fast, it's going to shed more frequently. A snake that doesn't eat very much is going to shed less frequently. And if anybody's ever seen a snake that's close to shed, they kind of get what we call like a milky or opaque-like appearance, and their eyes are often blue. Cool thing about snakes is that they don't have eyelids. They can't close their eyes. They have a clear scale that protects that eye. So that needs to be shed when the snake sheds its skin as well. So it kind of comes off that scale that there's another scale developing under it, and it's kind of pulled apart, and it gives it kind of this blue-like appearance. At that point, the snake is very close to shedding. And this is why these snakes actually use the same spots and find seclusion when they're shedding, because they're really vulnerable to predation. They can't see, and they're ready to get rid of this old layer of skin, so they tend to go someplace and hide during that time. And then they pull the eye caps come off first, and then the snake will find some kind of rough surface to maybe snag that old skin on, and they pull that skin off their body, and out comes a new colorful snake.
So, Steve, we have a lot of folks that are not necessarily worried about snakes, or they're okay with snakes as long as they're not near their house, in their house, in their basements,
garages or barns.
Barns. Yeah. Are there things that'll help keep snakes away from their house? Are there activities or behaviors, where they pile their wood up for their fire stove kind of stuff that may help keep snakes away from areas they don't necessarily want to see them?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, and I think it's important to talk about that. So there's a couple things that snakes look for when they're trying to find a good place to hang out, okay? And one is a lot of places to hide, okay? So anytime you pile up wood up next to your house, or you maybe have really intensive landscaping or something like that, you could provide a good habitat for a snake to kind of hang out and feel safe. So if you don't want them right up next to their house, I would recommend putting things like log piles or piles of debris or leaf piles, things like that, away from the house. Okay. The second thing that snakes are looking for is moisture, and sometimes decent temperatures, right? So if you have like a dripping hose or a faucet or some place where water accumulates, sometimes snakes will come over there, because just like all other animals, they need to take a drink and they need to find a place. So try to address those types of issues. And the third thing is prey, having available food source. So probably most of the reasons why snakes are in barns or around houses is they find things that they like to eat around there. Okay, so if you have issues with rodents in your barn, it's probably way easier, in fact, to address the rodent issue than it is to address the snake issue. Okay, so if you remove those prey items that the snakes like eating from the close proximity of your houses, you won't get them. Another important reason why snakes tend to be around homes and barns, especially older homes, is they often find these places as suitable areas to hibernate over the winter. I often get calls from people where a snake is in their house, especially in September or October, and then again they see them around the foundations in April These tend to be older homes, and the snakes have found that they can get into the foundation and spend the winter there. My recommendation is address those issues in the foundation during the summer months. Greatly reduce the probability that you're going to either entomb or entrap a snake in your house. Okay? If you do this in the winter, when the snakes are in the foundation, they're going to come out in the spring, and then you're going to have them like all inside your house potentially, or things like that, right? So address this during the summer months, and hopefully you can reduce the snake observations.
Yeah, I have received the picture of a snake in a bathroom around a toilet, so it does happen. So it's sometimes you can do all the right things and still have oddities occur, right? And the best thing to do is not freak out.
Oh,
as
yes,
best you can. I mean, although that would be, even for me, alarming.
Yeah,
so,
and I would say that with the snakes that usually are in people, I haven't seen a venomous snake in somebody's house, right? Never a copperhead, definitely never a rattlesnake. Most of the time, it's the rat snakes that get into people's houses, because sometimes they're up in your attic eating bats or just hanging out in there, right? Maybe think it's a suitable place to hibernate. And then they end up getting in your house.
So obviously snakes can climb then.
Oh, yes. Yes, very much. Then the other one that I see quite a bit are ringnecks, who are in the basements. And, that's a common one, and they're relatively calm snakes that don't react to humans. And you can usually, as long as you ID them as a ringneck, pick them up and put them outside. And there's no problems.
Yeah, they almost never bite.
No,
so,
they'll poop on you.
Yes.
They'll poop on you, and it smells.
Yeah.
So...
they release that musk. Most snakes do that. So they released a really pungent musk, and it smells bad.
Great. So I guess we're wrapping up here, right? So one of the big things we want to touch on again to make sure everyone has it and are aware of it is our website for Snake ID, and that's kysnakes.ca.uky.edu. And if you need to get a hold of us to get the link sent to you, if you missed that, don't hesitate to email myself at mattspringer@uky.edu, and I'll be happy to send you the link to the website.
Okay. We'll post those on our website as well. So you both have presented us with a lot of great information on snakes. And are there one or two takeaway items that you would like our listeners to leave with?
I would just like to say, you should have an appreciation for these animals, right? Even if you don't like them, they kind of creep you out, you should appreciate them. They do a lot of important things in Kentucky's forests and grasslands, and even in suburban areas. And they're really interesting animals. We didn't touch upon it, but they have a diversity of natural histories that's really unique. And so take some time, read about snakes. If you see one in your backyard, observe it, watch what it's doing, and I think you'll learn to appreciate them.
Kind of going off of what Steve said, you don't have to love snakes to appreciate them, and at the very least, you don't have to love or appreciate snakes to be able to identify which ones you have to be worried about. So spend the time to learn how to at least identify those 4 species, and realistically, it's 3 species that you have to pay attention to, because pygmy rattlesnakes are really, if you see one, I should probably shake your hand.
Yeah, right.
There may be, maybe 10 individuals in the entire state. It's a possibility that there's that few.
We don't know. They're very hard to come by.
Yeah, so it's those 3, and honestly, if you're in eastern Kentucky, central Kentucky, it's copperheads and rattlesnakes. So if you can at least familiarize yourself with those, if you see a snake and you know it's not those, and that way you can step away from the situation instead of taking, say, a shovel to it. So that would be my big thing, is try to take that one step and being able to ID 2 species of snakes, and go from there.
Good. Well, thank you, Dr. Price and Dr. Springer, for joining us today. And if you would like more information on what you've heard on this segment of today's show, you can visit our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org. Thank you for joining us today, and we have a new show schedule for spring 2019. You can listen to us live on WRFL 88.1 FM on Mondays from 11 a.m. to noon. And if you miss the Monday shows, you can listen to our podcasts on our website at www.fromthewoodsky.org.
Hey there. If you're enjoying this podcast from WRFL Lexington, you may enjoy our live radio stream at WRFL.FM and, of course, via radio at 88.1 FM in the central Kentucky area. We have a wide variety of programs you're sure to enjoy. Just go to WRFL.FM/schedule and see what programs appeal most to you. Thanks again for listening to this podcast from WRFL Lexington.